Hi, my name is John, and this video describes my method for getting super fast and precise exposure control, especially in rapidly changing environments like street photography. This video is specific to my Fujifilm X106, but I like this method so much I also use it with my Sony cameras. There's a separate video for that setup, and it's linked in the description and in the playlist at the end of this video. Now for a little backstory. My journey with all of this started out when I first got serious about street photography, having recently purchased my first Fujifilm camera, an X Pro 3. The workflow was completely different from the Sony world in which I live for my professional work. In particular, there was no PASM dial and no memory presets to quickly recall exposure settings with my X Pro. I ended up selling the X Pro in favor of my X100V, and that's when I really got serious about trying to become one with the Fujifilm workflow, particularly when it came to precise exposure control for street photography. Now, to complicate things even further, I really enjoy night street photography and working with intentional camera movement and slow shutter speed, but that led me to miss more than a few really awesome opportunities because I couldn't quickly change the slow shutter speed settings and know I would get the best combination of ISO and shutter speed for any given aperture. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the look and feel of those tactile controls, but they treat ISO like they would for a film camera, making it the secondary function of the shutter speed dial. You have to pull up on the dial and set the ISO through the little view window. It's very cool, but not very practical for digital cameras. I was about to give up on the Fujifilm system when my wife made an offhand comment, something to the effect, "I don't know what you're doing, but your street stuff looks much better." So I decided to try a little harder with that camera. After a lot of experimenting, I finally found the answer in the two command dials on the camera and how they're set up. But it also required me to think of the exposure triangle a little bit differently, more as a seesaw where all three of the exposure components can easily change on the fly and work seamlessly with the camera's metering system in case you want a little more safety than running in pure manual. Those command dials are perfectly located for quick access, so you have a much faster way to set your camera exposure without having to take your eye away from the shot. And the ability to use those command dials got me experimenting with different configurations until I found one that lets me have very fast, very precise exposure control while still allowing the camera's metering system to save the day when that's needed. I call my setup sensor gain priority. I made a short video to explain my logic behind this. It's in the description and in the playlist at the end of this video. It's not camera specific. Okay, so let me show you exactly how I set this up using my newly acquired X106. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, first, let's check our firmware. We can do that by pressing and holding the back display button while we turn the camera on. That will show us our firmware. And here's the firmware that I'm on now. It's version 1.2.1. It's time to set the camera up for sensor gain priority. Now we want to make sure that we have our shutter speed set to automatic and our ISO set to C for command dial. We also want to make sure our exposure compensation knob is set to C for command dial. And our aperture ring is set to A, which allows us to control the aperture through the command dial. So let's go to the menu by pressing the menu button on the back. Then let's go down to the wrench. Let's go over to button dial settings. Let's go ahead and go down to page 2, all the way down to aperture ring settings. We want to make sure that it's in command instead of auto. This allows us to control our aperture with the command dial if it's in the A position. Okay, we're all done with that. So we'll go ahead and hit back. Now it's time to program our function buttons. We do that by pressing and holding the back display button on the back of the camera. And we'll come down to function 1, which is a little button on the top of the camera. and I have that one set to photometry. Okay, moving on. Now let's go to function 2. I have that set to neutral density, and that's very handy because all you have to do is press that button to turn the neutral density filter off and on. Okay, I'm going to skip all the touchscreens because I don't use those. The next one is AEL/AFL, and that's the button on the back of the camera. I have that set to AF on. That way I can acquire autofocus by pressing that and holding it. I can move the focus area and then focus anywhere I want. By the way, I can tap the joystick and it'll put back the center like so. Okay, back to the menu. Now it's on to page 2, and this controls how the rear command dial acts when you press it down as if it were a button. I have that one set to AF mode. That allows me to quickly set how I want the AF mode to work. So I'm pressing it, I'm on wide tracking, but I can use the joystick to select whatever I'd like and then just hit OK. Next is the selector lever for the electronic viewfinder. You can actually program that, and I have that programmed to preview our depth of field whenever it's activated. So I'll go ahead and increase my aperture by quite a bit. Let's say to like so. I'll go ahead and bring up my ISO as well, something like that. Now, if I want to preview my depth of field, let's go ahead and come over here and focus on our little TV set. And now I can activate that lever. And as you can see, we can see our depth of field, and the little icon shows up in the upper left. And then when you take a photo, it goes back. Now one more time, and there you are. That's really handy. Okay, now it's time to program our front command dial. We get to that by pressing and holding in the front command dial. It gives us this menu, and as you can see, we have programmable functions here. And then this fourth function sets what happens when you rotate the rear command dial. So for my first programmable function, I've selected aperture. Now I can do that because earlier in our menu settings, we set up that aperture ring to give us the command dial when the ring is in the A position. Then next, I've set for exposure compensation. This one I've set for none. But if you like to shoot manual sometimes, I suggest you go ahead and put that one in shutter speed. That would be up here. Then lastly, I program the action of the rear command dial to ISO when it's turned. Now these settings allow me to see my shutter speed, my aperture, my exposure compensation, and my ISO all in pretty much real time. And it shows the effect of these actions. As you can see, I'm rotating the exposure compensation and that shutter speed is changing. Now the same will happen if I tap one time and it takes us over to aperture. I'll go ahead and lower that aperture. And you see the shutter speed went way up. But I can counter that by taking my ISO down to where I'm comfortable with the shutter speed depending on what I want to do. And that's sensor gain priority. I hope this helps. Thanks again for watching as always. And we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye for now.